Good evening. Welcome to our fourth installment of our Beyond the Label webinar series, where we've been looking at dyslexia and all the skills that lie behind the label of dyslexia. Now, tonight we're looking at perfect practice makes perfect. But before we launch into that, let's just remind ourselves what we've said the last few webinars. Now, first, we've mentioned that our memory system starts with input that goes into our sensory memory, which is from visual, auditory, kinesthetic. We have loads of information coming through every single second of the day. We can't give attention to all of that. Everything is not important, so most of it goes missing. But that we attend to, that we think is important, goes to our short-term memory, where it is transferred into visual and auditory imagery and or phonological loop per se, and where it's then processed through our working memory into our long-term memory. Now, previously we've looked at our sensory memory, short-term memory, and how we can improve it. And currently we're looking at our long-term memory. And just a reminder that these skills are not separate from the cognitive skills of attention, processing, and logical reasoning. And those we will be looking at later on in our session. So you'll see that we've already looked at dyslexia, sensory, short-term memory, long-term memory, semantic memory. Tonight, we're looking at the procedural memory, and moving forward, we're going to be looking at the other skills. So just to remind ourselves, long-term memory, episodic are our life experiences, so personal memory, such as our wedding day, first day of school, etc. Semantic memory are those facts and concepts that we need to master and remember. And it can be from personal information like telephone numbers to more school-based information. And then procedural memory are those routines and skills or muscle memory. So riding a bike, learning to ride a car, brushing our teeth, getting dressed, all of those things would be routines and skills. Now, in semantic memory, we said that to improve those, it's important that we gauge the interest of children, that we make learning important, and that we grab their attention at the beginning of a lesson to make sure that they're actually taking in what we are delivering. We talked about interactive and practical means multisensory learning, as well as making experiences real life, like investigations that are practical and outings to the beach to look at ecological discoveries, etc. Because the more you can make it personal, it links to your episodic memory and it becomes a life memory instead of just memorizing facts. We also looked at how to reduce volume, how to reduce the complexity of information by never introducing new information without revisiting what is known, by always, as much as you can, starting with concrete learning before you make it abstract, to start with simple examples before you introduce complex examples. We talked about the importance of study skills courses to really look at how we can make summaries and reduce our volume and make those links explicit. And then we've talked about access. So if your child is struggling to access the curriculum, before we can worry about strategies to improve the semantic memory, we really have to go and make sure that those basics are in place. And that could include professional help outside. We will also, in our next webinar next year, we're going to be looking at where occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, educational psychologists, where everybody fits into the whole program process of making sure the basics are in place. And then also EduBlocks that deliver learning experiences for children and develop cognitive skills. But tonight we're looking at one more strategy, and that one more strategy is linking our semantic memory and learning to procedural memory. In short, practice, practice, practice. If you look at these three pictures, these are all people that have excelled in certain areas. So you have your rugby players, you have your Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, you've got Mozart, who is a very famous componist and piano player. And none of them got here by chance. They all practiced and practiced and practiced. But most importantly, if we look at our practice makes perfect, it's not really just about how much you practice, because if I can go and sit in front of the piano, I'm not going to turn into a Mozart. But it's about perfect practice that makes perfect. I'm going to explain that. Let's look at the theory. Our brain consists of about 86 billion neurons that send messages to each other in our brain. Now, that's a wonderful thing to think about, because in the past, the concept was that the brain was static, unchangeable after a certain amount of time. So they would say that if a child hasn't developed this skill by the age of 8, chances are it's never going to develop. Now, a discovery in the 20th century meant that the brain is plastic, new pathways, new cells are created constantly, which means that it's not true that development stops at a certain age. Children can still develop their brains, adults can still develop their brains up to a high age. And why is that important for our learning? Well, let's just look at golf. Let's just imagine each learning skill related to golf as a separate pathway. So the strength of each pathway then relates to the strength in the skill. Okay, now before you even start hitting a ball in golf, I don't know if anybody has been for lessons, I certainly have. You don't get to hit the ball on your first session. You have to learn all the pre-swing skills. One of them are your footing. Now, the footing is interesting because that also varies according to the different clubs. So they'll choose a club and they'll teach you that footing. How you place your ball, how you place your club, how you grip, how you have to keep your body, your head, and then your eye position as you hit the ball. So those skills have to be practiced and practiced and practiced until it kind of becomes a body memory before you even get to the swing. Now, finally, you get to the swing, and here you have 5 more skills. You have your backswing, you've got your downswing, your connection with the ball, your follow through, and then your in position, all of which are important in terms of how you hit that ball. Now, if we look at it diagrammatically, we start with our pre-skills. They feed into our swing. And the swing then branches out to the 5 different swing positions to end up in our final hit of the ball and our end position. Now, you can almost see this as a neural network. Okay. Now, what's important is that if only even one of those skills, like your head and your eyes, and that was my problem. I really could not keep my head still. My head bounced up the whole time. The instructor even ended up holding my head to get it right. But I kept on having that bad habit of lifting up my head. And that fed into the swing, because the swing then was a problem. And it affects everything else. So even if my up is right and I swing through nicely, because my head is not right, my hit on the ball is not going to be right. Now, a few things here are important, so that the overall skill is just as strong as the weakest link. So each skill has to be perfect. The other is that it's essential that each skill is practiced correctly from the start. Now, when you have a bad habit, like I did with my head, it takes so much longer to get rid of that bad habit in order to establish a positive habit than it does to just learn a positive habit from the start. And then it's important that each skill is practiced to perfection so that it becomes automated. Now, let's just go and look at how that applies to learning and reading. So, like you can see, it's not, you can't just simply practice hitting a ball to hit a ball well. Okay. And in the same way, why do we then think that you can improve your reading simply by reading more? No, we need to look at the skills. So let's go and look at the skills. Okay. Pre-reading skills, just like our pre-swing, memory span, processing, concentration, vocabulary knowledge, all of those are important to have before we can even think about reading. Once those are in place, we then get to our emerging reading, sound knowledge, our letter sound knowledge, connecting the letter to the sound, our phonological and phonemic awareness, in other words, understanding that different sounds make up words, have to be in place before we can read. And then once we get to reading, we need to recognize our words. We need to be able to decode unfamiliar words. We need to be able to read with comprehension. And finally, we need to be able to apply our reading skills in study. So I want you to imagine this as a huge neurological network, a network that is just as strong as its weakest link. Okay. So now that you've got that in your mind, let's look at 5 key elements to consider when we want to make practice perfect. First of all, we have to have deliberate practice with the right support. In other words, you need to know what it is that your child is struggling with so that you can really hone in and focus on practicing that skill before you move on to the next skills. You need to set goals, small steps. When Rome is not built in one day, neither are reading skills or learning skills. In other words, you need to set very small targets that the child can achieve before you move on to the next. That will help with self-esteem, it will help with motivation, and it will also help your child to succeed. Timing. Now, no use to wade through hundreds of pieces of homework in the evening just to get it done when nothing is going in. So it's important, if your child is struggling, that you have a discussion with the teacher about what's really essential and that you focus on just those few things, practice it to perfection, and then take a break. So 20 minutes break, 20 minutes break, 20 minutes break, and really no longer than about an hour, hour and a half an evening that your child should be spending. When they're tired, nothing is going to go in. It's not going to process. It's not going to stick. It's not going to go into the long-term memory. Okay, then look at spaced repetition, which is regular overlearning. Now for teachers as well, but parents as well. If we, for example, worked on the skill of long multiplication, and we've been working on the skill and we've practiced it, then you can't leave it and now go on to division and say, done. No, you need to then give that child, your children, your learners, an example of long multiplication at the beginning of each of your next lessons. Keep on practicing that skill a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. Keep on revising their times tables knowledge, because that's extremely important to be able to long multiply. Then, for example, we do long division. We practice that every day. Oh, it's secure. So now you give a long multiplication as well as a division sum at the end, at the beginning of the lesson, so that they can keep on practicing those 2 skills. Later on, as new knowledge come in, for example, fractional knowledge, you might just practice your long multiplication once a week instead of every day, but you're still going to bring it in on a regular basis so that you keep on overlearning, overlearning, overlearning. So as you bring new knowledge in, you practice the other ones less, but you still practice. That's a very good way of helping your child to embed the knowledge while still learning new knowledge as well. Okay, then we talk about dependence, independence, and mastery. Now, a child that is struggling cannot learn independently. You can send them for a study skills course, but you cannot expect them to apply that independently because they need your help. They still need being taught. They need your help practicing. Because remember what we talked about, you cannot, if you practice on your own and you're not ready, you're going to practice mistakes. And mistakes are harder to get out of your system to bring in new habits than it is to set up those new habits from the beginning in the correct manner. So you need to sit with your child and you need to practice that and correct as you go along. Now, next step is where your child actually have secured the concept sufficiently that they can do some independent practice. But here, it's still important that they only do 2 or 3 examples at a time, and then you correct and give feedback. So in case there is a mistake, that they don't practice that mistake with 20 sums. 2, 3, you notice the mistake, you correct it, and they then carry on practicing it correctly, and you test again, test again, test again. So it's a kind of interdependence process. And then lastly, by mastery, it means that your child is now so secure that they can now teach others. And that's your final element of really securing information, is if a child can teach others. Now, teachers in your classes, I'm sure all of you are already doing it, that kind of peer teaching support or buddy support, where you have a weaker learner with a stronger learner, and they support the weaker learner. And you know what? That's not just for the weaker learner. That's actually helpful for the stronger learner as well, because they embed information by being able to teach others. And then lastly, be patient. There are just no shortcuts to getting to this perfection. You have to just practice, 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 and be patient. Now, on that note, we can look at this pyramid. where you'll see that repetition goes from the bottom to the top, content goes from the top to the bottom, which means that a lot of repetition is needed when you're at this dependent stage. Just to secure a small amount of information or just a very minor skill, you'll need a lot of practice. But then as your independence grow, you can spend less time practicing to secure larger amounts of information. And when you get to the top, and that's where children have a high skill level, you'll find that with very little effort, they can secure a large amount of information. So be patient. If your child is still at the dependent stage, they will get to the independent stage with your help. Okay. So finally, if your child is struggling, please don't wait. Please just don't wait and see for another term and yet another term. Remember, the more they practice the mistakes, the harder it's going to be to help them to succeed. So if your child is struggling with reading, with learning, struggling with those cognitive elements of processing memory, please contact EduBlocks because we can help you. Our program is scientifically developed. It's been in use for over 35 years. And we don't only help children that struggle, we also help children that are successful in their learning, but want to progress even further and become even stronger in their learning. Okay, then lastly, visit our website, go and have a look at some of the testimonials of parents where they tell their stories for their children. And then lastly, thank you very much for listening and have a great evening. Thank you.